what I want to do is just perhaps to introduce to you an aircraft that you don't know anything about at all, and that's it here. This actually is a Stirling Mark 1, and it actually, in essence, is a sectionized drawing of it. And I can only give you the sheer facts of it. The Mark 1 was accepted by the Air Force prior to the beginning of the war. And in essence, the Air Ministry allowed it to go ahead, and it was in the process of being built when suddenly one of the crazy little clerks in the Air Ministry said to the Secretary of Air, "But just a minute, they won't fit in our hangars." And they found out because they had to lop 7 feet off each wing. That's the only way they could fit in the hangars. Now that was terribly important before the war, but the war was obviously just about to open. Sure enough, it started. By this time, the whole design had to be changed, the wing design. We had to fit in the hangars. It didn't matter that later the various other aircraft that exist wouldn't fit in those same hangars, because of course they had to build new airfields, new hangars and everything else. But in point of fact, what created the problem with this aircraft, that it didn't start and last for the whole war, was the fact that they took 7 feet off each end of the wing. Thus they had to increase the power of the motors, they had to increase the thickness and depth of the wing, and in essence, when you realise how much bigger it is than the aircraft you perhaps heard of and knew of in the war, you'll understand better. The big problem was, take for example this, the original aircraft had 4 1250 horsepower Hercules motors. When they had to take 7 feet off, they had to increase the horsepower to 1600 horsepower. They also had to lift the undercarriage, because one of the points made was that we had to have a mid-underturret. By the way, it was never fitted, but they had to have it. So we had this great big long undercut. So we had a massive aircraft that is hard to sort of give you an idea of how far it was off the ground. Nothing in comparison to today's terms, but in those days, I mean, most of those men are the same height as that wheel. It was 25 feet to this pilot's cockpit, but in those days it was terrifying. If you come from a Tiger Moth to an Oxford, to a Wellington, to a Stirling, you're all low aircraft, and suddenly bang, you hit this great big massive thing with these massive horsepower motors, 4 1850 horsepour motors, 4 1600 horsepower motors initially in the Mark 1, naturally created problems, as you can imagine, of on takeoffs particularly. But the Mark 1 was soon superseded by the Mark 3. The Mark 3 was increased again, because actually the Mark 1, whilst it had the 44 1600 horsepower Hercules 9 motors, had a top speed of 300 miles an hour, and it carried 8 tons of bombs. Now, it was the aircraft, no other aircraft, not even the Halifax or the Lancaster, could ever take the same amount of bombs to the Ruhr that the Stirling could, because they had the number of bays, and I'll show you this in a minute. In essence, the aircraft was designed to bomb the Ruhr, not anywhere else. That was the area of Germany where all manufacturing took place, war manufacturing particularly. So in essence, you had an aircraft specifically ordered by government to do a job, then suddenly, of course, they didn't think in terms of the future. But fortunately, then of course, when Bomber Command demanded so much effort and so much tonnage on the Ruhr, they brought out the Mark III, which had then 4 1850 horsepower motors, and it could then carry 10 tons of bombs to the Ruhr. Now, to give you an idea of the differential between the Stirling, the Lancaster, and the Wellington, here you have the situation. Would you like to hold that for me, please, Brian? This is the Wellington, which was a bomber that was mostly also in service at the time the war broke out, with another particular aircraft, the Handley Page. We won't talk about very much at all, Brian, will we? I'm talking about Brian over there. Who flew one of them. And I assure you, I don't know how he survived. This is the Lancaster. That's the Stirling. Therefore, it gives you an idea of the actual size differential. On top of that, if you look at the bomb bays, look at this bomb bay for the Stirling. There's the Lanc. And on top of that, the Stirling had two things that no other aircraft had. It also had bomb bays in the wings, so we could carry 3 500-pound bombs in each wing as well. So that's where the 10 tons come from. For to do that job, therefore, you had to have these high-powered motors. But believe me, with this long undercarriage, you can just imagine the torque that exists on taking off an aircraft with all the propellers going that way. Well, I can only tell you that all Lancaster pilots who had to fly Stirlings on circuits and bumps at their conversion unit before they went onto their Lancs hated them. Because the thing is, you have to, when opening up the throttles, there's one finger that's got to go right the way up there first. You start off quietly and you put the starboard outer and inner, you're putting them up like mad to overcome the torque. But the snag was, of course, there's always the opportunity, if you don't take your other engines up as well properly, in essence, what you're going to get is not to swing the way you think you're going to go. It goes the opposite way. And the big problem is you had to control this aircraft because of the sheer power. And that's the thing that frightened the hell, I think, out of all the pilots that didn't like them at all. And you talk to all Lancaster pilots who had to go through the system of using the Stirling or the Con, they didn't like them. But I can only tell you that every Stirling pilot is absolutely dedicated to the Stirling because, in essence, what else was happening? It was like flying a Tiger Moth in terms of 4-engine aircraft. It was so light, it's so aerodynamically perfect that we never had any trouble doing all the major things to try and avoid attack and everything else. We found that it was light on the controls in comparison to, I flew the Halley and the Liberator after this, and then I eventually went on to Transport Command and flew the Mark V Stirling, which was a civil version, which had the small undercarriage, had the extra 7 feet on each wing, and believe me, we had a real aircraft then. It was quite a change. Now, as far as Arnhem is concerned, we have to think in terms now of gliders. Now, there are 2 major gliders produced for the purpose of taking airborne troops to the continent, or in any case, anywhere. That was the Horsa and the Hamilton. It only carried tanks. And there were no tanks taken to Arnhem, so we can forget it. But the Horsa glider was made of 3-ply, so was the Hamilcar. So they were easily destroyed, they were cheap to produce, and they were obviously expendable. You only have one journey. But of course, what we had to do, and I fortunately was lucky enough, and in that essence, at this point in time, I want to point out, I have 20 copies here of something I had to write in 2001 to try and get some money out of the DVA to hold a reunion of Arnhem guys here in West Australia. And it's that fun. I've got 20 copies here of the thing I had to write out for him, which concerns what happened in England, in Europe, in terms of aircraft and what the losses we had as personnel and everything else. And I would like those that weren't in Europe to have these. You can hand these out, but at the same time, I'm giving a copy to Brian so that copies can be taken off. Now, on top of that, you'll find that not only is it giving the Minister a briefing on what went on right through and through Arnhem and everything else. But also I've got bits and pieces that point in fact show and just extract from a book showing my aircraft when I did all the original experiments sent by my CO. My aircraft was modified, and I did all the experiments with the Hawser and the Hamel car and with paratroopers. They modified my aircraft and I was sent off. I never found out why. And I was given the assistant flight commander of the other flight on our squadron with two of it here, but it was my crew and my aircraft and just him and ourselves. So that I was in this right from the start. Then from when we got back, we had to, of course, train our own people in the use and the take-off of gliders. The Stirling turned out to be a perfect tug. We were a bomber command at that time, number 3 group, near Cambridge, and we were the first squadron posted out of bomber command to do this job specifically. And in essence, that's the reason I'm probably standing up here now, because I'm quite sure if I'd stayed in bomber command, I might be here. I think it was one of the marvelous things, but at the same time, we did have our hairy times. Now, I'm not going to try say any more about, I'm not going to necessarily get to Arnhem, necessarily my ops and things, but what I'd like to try and give to you as pilots, some of the ideas which you perhaps never have even thought about, in terms of what it's like to try and fly a very tough aircraft, a very big, heavy aircraft, with a glider behind it. It's really quite something. Now, when I came back, when Flight Lieutenant Askey and myself, I was just a brand spanking new flying officer, came back to the squadron, we found out right from that first moment that there's a great variation, and I think most of you would agree with this, that there is a variation always in the capacities and abilities of pilots, all covered by experience, but not always by experience. Some have an unusual ability with aircraft that others don't have. And we found out to our absolute horror, when we got back, for example, the first person I had to take up was the CO, who had sent me on this whole thing. To my absolute amazement, I found that he wasn't very capable. But here's a man in his late 30s. He'd been in the Air Force for a long time, and this was, I think, he'd come from training command to our squadron, and he found the Stirling hard enough to compete, to cope with, let alone when we came and had to literally have this great massive thing behind us and take it off and release it at the right time, and well, at least they released themselves in the general time. So we found out that in fact, I couldn't say anything. I did 3 circuits and bumps with him, and he literally wasn't capable, quite frankly, of taking off the 4th. And he said, well, Minchin, I think perhaps I would have a go now. And I said, well, sir, I'm terribly sorry. I think we ought to do another one, but couldn't we leave it to another day? Oh, he said, fine, if you feel that way. Good, right, we'll do that. Well, then I got hold of Flight Lieutenant Askey and the mess that night and said, what the hell am I going to do? He's no more capable of flying that blasted thing than anyone. And he said, well, oh. And I said, well, look, you're my superior. You're the official assistant flight commander of A Flight. You tell him. He said, oh, thanks very much. Well, I was 20 and he was about 28, so I think it was fair. And in any case, when I went to take up my own flight commander, I found, fortunately, that he was far more able to do things. But when it came to night flying, and I can only tell you that one of the greatest and most frightening things for a glider pilot is to get behind a Stirling when he's never been behind one before. Because what he's got to do, as you take off, he's got to go up through your wash. Now what he does, of course, is keep going, because he's got such a shock, and he just keeps going, he can't stop. But you know what he does to the tug on the way of takeoff? Have you ever thought about it when you just started to take off nicely? Bang, your tail's pulled up, you're back on the ground again. that's exactly what was happening. We briefed, despite the fact that we briefed our glider pilots before we ever took off on those experiments, the tremendous power that existed. They'd only be going off behind a small little aircraft that only had 2 engines. We fortunately had the top-line glider pilot, chap in charge of this particular organisation. What we discovered was that despite the briefing, they still took it up. But I told them, I was not the flight lieutenant, Askey took the first one off, and I pointed out to the glider pilots, I will say, if you cause problem, if you don't get up through everything and then come back and sit on it quickly, I'll say, release, release, I will release, release, release. Now, if I say that, I'll bloody well pull the tit, because we are not going to crash. And so when they went up through, we had to say that. I had to say, release, release, release. So they came down and they sat on the top of the disturbance. But in essence, when you're trying to teach your flight commander these little points, and you find that the glider pilots by this time are getting used to it a bit more, but some of them weren't, and you probably got a new one, but we had the same problem again. But when it came to night flying, it was even worse, because there you have no actual things but your hot engines, and you do have 2 little tiny lights at the end of your wing that they can see, but they're not massive, because after all said and done, you're going to be on operations. So in essence, we found the same old problem, that they went up too far and they nearly caused crash after crash. However, my flight commander, on his after his second time round, said to me, Minchin, I'm fine, I'll take the next one. I said, well, sir, I think you need more. And he said, well, no, I'm fine, don't worry about it. He ended up in hospital, in the Burns hospital, with his whole crew. He killed 2 of them because he didn't release the glider. He did, in effect, go. So the effect of this was quite frightening on the squadron. We therefore had to categorize our pilots. Now, this was the thing that the flight lieutenant Askey and myself talked about quietly. How do you introduce this idea as when you're little guys and the thing, when you've got the boss and the 2 flight commanders, and of course on top of this we had another squadron there we had to train as well. So in essence, it was quite a time and quite a business. And so therefore it is quite a business to try and think in terms of flying with a loaded glider, great distances, and we had already done this at D-Day, so that what we did, we eventually had to talk to the CO. He was a very nice guy, so a very understanding man. And so we categorized our pilots in accordance with, we had an A special rating, an A rating, and a B. Now, A special rating, to give you an idea, and here I think we better just give you some concept of what supposedly is depiction. This was a watercolour that was ordered at the 50th anniversary by the Keble Historic Society, where our squadrons were, and it just supposedly shows you me. In fact, it happens to be my aircraft taking off. It was the only big piece of black and white film they had of an aircraft taking off from, and it just by chance was mine. And it depicts what supposedly happens. In point of fact, it's all wrong, as I'll show you in a minute, or in a few minutes' time. The factor is that that is completely, and the guy that did it on behalf of the thing had no idea what was all about in trying to get aircraft off the ground. Can you imagine an aircraft, from the Mark III we developed the Mark IV Stirling, because literally when we started to do this work with, and that is the Mark IV, you may notice it's got no front turret now, no better upper turret. All we've got is a back turret with 4 guns. How the hell can we defend ourselves? And how can we defend ourselves anyway? With a great massive glider behind you with all this weight. So in essence, the whole basic concept was to try and find an answer to this, and then the only answer was they created we made part of the 2nd Tactical Air Force, therefore we were protected and had to be protected completely by fighter aircraft. The Mark IV was, had a top speed of over 300 knots, and it had these modified bomb containers, which only bomb bays, which only contain. We were able to adapt them for container dropping, so we could supply troops as well as and take them with us to help those that we took in the gliders or inside the aircraft as paratroopers. What I've got to remind you is how the devil can you get off 48 aircraft, have them get together. Now this is just one squadron. Then you've got about 10 other airfields with 2 squadrons on them. How do you get this whole force together to get it across the channel to D-Day, or to get it across the channel, not so much the channel, but the sea to Holland and to Arnhem. Arnhem was a long way away from where our stations were. And in essence, this categorization of pilots meant that a special rating was able to take a jeep with a machine gun mounting, a 4-inch gun and a trailer of ammunition, plus the whole of the crew. They were only allowed to, for a small group of us pilots, that were allowed to take that because that was the heaviest load we took. And the A-rating men, the A-rating specials and the A-rating men were allowed to take and tow the full gliders with a full load of paratroopers. After all said and done, you've got to have good pilots, making sure they don't break tow ropes, get their paratroopers to the target. And on top of that, of course, to get them across the sea. What we discovered, well, then we had this Category B, that they were only allowed to carry equipment in their glider and a limited number of paratroops to service that equipment, whatever it was going. That was radios, all sorts of things. So that's the way in which it was organised and thought about, and fortunately that we did this, because the tragedy of Arnhem was that I guess it was, I think someone said here, the historian that wrote I think the best book on the whole history of Arnhem, the Battle of Arnhem, said it was a highly overrated expectation of generals who had no idea and concept of the demands they made. It was too ambitious. It was called Montgomery's folly, but it was Boyd Browning's folly just as much. General Boyd Browning had never been in action in this war. He'd done a good job in the First World War, but in this war he had had no actual ground action. So in point of fact, he tied up 39 gliders just to take his ruddy headquarters across to Arnhem, which of course was absolutely horrific in terms of, well, there's a poem that was written about him. We haven't got time to read it today because it's the most amusing thing I've come across. In essence, the big problem is, perhaps as you as pilots will ever understand, is the sheer concentration that's required to try and take a glider off, to then marshal it, to make it so that you can get a whole force together, not just one station, but 10 stations, and then get that whole force that it can then be protected by a cover of fighters, and get them across a sea, across the land, the sea, and then get them through to Holland and drop them. Now, this is where the variation in pilots became noticeable. For example, and I will say this, there were some of us, one or two, a few of us, that never ever broke a tow rope. And yet, there were many, many pilots that broke tow ropes. Now, I could never understand why, because it only takes care, but the concentration is quite horrific. You have to ease out the aircraft. You're only towing aircraft at about 2,000 feet. Now, there's always problems at 2,000 feet. It's not a smooth ride, particularly in Europe, and at the hours sometimes in which we had to operate. So that the concentration effort was what I think most of you would perhaps find rather unusual, perhaps hard to understand. Certainly our previous speaker would understand better. He had to fly very low and marshal cattle. Well, I can only tell you that part of the job we used to have to do, we used to have to fly at 250 feet maximum under radar height to drop paratroopers and to drop SAS teams and spies and supply the underground over Europe, but we were only allowed to operate in the moon period, of course. You just try and think about that aircraft doing that. I mean, you've got to have young people, you've got to have madmen, you've got to have pilots that don't understand what they're doing. The big problem is trying to marshal and to get your aircraft off quickly. Now, believe it or not, our record, by the way, my own flight, never was ever beaten in the whole of 38 group for getting aircraft off fastest. We always led every takeoff. Our record was 1 minute 13 seconds between aircraft taking off. Now I'll illustrate and try to give you an idea of how that is done. I've tried to give a little drawing. That photograph, that painting's wrong because what should be there is long at the back, at the very end of the runway, should be all the gliders already in position. They're on they're on the east side of the runway, and the tugs are on the side of the aircraft. And I show here something that I'm a bit embarrassed about this because my neighbours, when I went off to Arnhem last year, I've got two geophysicists who took a little tiny film, a little tiny piece of film that big that I'd given to the Keble Historical Society. They thought it was the marshalling and the takeoff for Arnhem. In point of fact, it was D-Day because we only dropped parachutes. But I'm sorry about the top part, but that is how you marshal your aircraft. That is the marshalling for D-Day where we had paratroopers only. So there's two squadrons lined up, one each side of the runway. Now, the same thing happens with the gliders. The gliders are on the runway and with their tow ropes already set out. Now the tugs, by the way, marshal right down the side because it's only the early ones that are well in front of the gliders, the early ones that are going to take off. And so they come onto the airstrip. There's a ground staff banging in the plug to the back of the Stirling, and off it goes. Now, you take off one side, the other side, one side, the other side. We got it down to such a stage that we could take off with a glider once every about 30 seconds, 1 minute 30 seconds, which is quite unbelievable. Not all managed that. We used to have to graduate our pilots again, and so we had the slower ones of our groups towards the rear. Now I unfortunately had to leave off practically every blasted op we ever did with gliders or exercise because we'd won the thing, and then the second flight, whether it was the other squadron or our own, would be on the other side. We would take off. Now you've got to take a great big massive turn to each side. You've got to go far enough away so that when you circle back to pick up the rest, in between the gliders that have been behind you are feeding in to your lead, and then you eventually come right the way through, and you try and make it so that you arrive over your own airport again with by this time about 3 layers to 4 layers of guys with gliders behind them, and you're picking up the end. You're picking up the last slow ones through. Now that takes, if you take it at 1.5 minutes, you're taking 24 aircraft off each side. You've still got 48 aircraft at 1.5. So you can imagine it's quite a business to get the whole thing coordinated for one station. Then on top of that, we were lucky because we were the originators, the original people in this whole thing operating. We always were the leaders. And so all the other, we would then fly through, and the other squadrons would feed in to that, so that the fighter aircraft could cover the whole lot. And that's the way in which we gradually formed up and flew across. Unfortunately, whilst we never lost an aircraft on our station, when we took the gliders across to Arnhem in the first 2 lifts, but we lost gliders. The first one came to pieces, was pulled to pieces about 30 k's from the takeoff point. This happened, unfortunately. Others broke their tow ropes over the sea or on the way and never made it. And this happened with the B-class pilots mostly, particularly the one particular one, and I know him well, and he's dead. I sat next to his grave at Arnhem just recently when I was over there, and he had the wireless equipment, which they eventually caused the real problems at Arnhem. And of course he broke his tow rope, the stuff went into the sea, and our CO, for some stupid reason I'll never understand, and war has a lot of crazy things that go wrong, when that guy came back, well, he was back there when we got back, the CO told Green that he'd be on the next day to take the alternative equipment back again. So both Askey and myself, I went to Askey and said, "This is ridiculous. I mean, we've never broken tow ropes. We shouldn't have to take that back. This is vital stuff." And so we went to the CO and said, "Let us take this back. It's too important." And he said, "No, Ron, we can't do that. If Flight Sergeant Green doesn't take it, he'll never be any use to us anymore. He would think that we have no trust in him whatsoever." So you know what happened, of course. The tow rope broke again. He never ever got it to Arnhem.
What were these tow ropes made out of? Nylon or steel or just rope?
I'm not sure myself. Nylon for sure is back, but they had a thing through the centre of them, which allowed us to communicate. They were a special thing. I was never ever sure. They were quite heavy. That was the point. That was the whole key. You had to ride. You must. You had to take it, and you had to try and make sure that you didn't try to jerk your aircraft in any sense of the word. You didn't try to increase your speed or anything. The whole key to towing gliders, and the operational normal speed was 145 miles per hour. You could take them up to 160 if things were dangerous. That's, for example, when you're forming up, some of the stragglers had to use 160 while we're still staying all at 145. But we had the power to do far more, but we didn't dare use it. So the thing is to keep your whole flying very smooth, very cautious and careful. That's the whole guts of towing. Yeah. That a lot of Australians were in gliders, as glider pilots, because they got across to England and they couldn't, particularly through Arnhem, they couldn't get into, and the crossing of the Rhine, they couldn't get into bombing or anything like that because there was no time left. They were too late in the war, so they volunteered to be glider pilots. And this is one of the things I was going to get to, but we're not going to get to it today. It's one of those things where there's another Arnhem coming up, you see that, but it's going to be a year away. Whole problem of getting aircraft together at the bridge had poles in them, which was the norm. To try and, for example, when we dropped the gliders at D-Day, we had to drop them into fields where there'd been poles set up all the time to ensure that gliders wouldn't land. But what they tried to do was to knock their wings off as they went through them. That was one way of stopping. And there was one way of killing himself too, if they didn't do the right thing. But in essence, then of course the glider itself, the back of the glider then can be blown off, and out comes the gun and everything else, or out come your troops, or whatever it is, the equipment, what have you.
What was
the point that you'll find, if any of you get this thing, that I've given you the actual casualties of Arnhem, and the one thing they don't have there is the casualties of the glider pilot regiment, which are horrific. Now, once a glider pilot got on the ground, and there was always 2 glider pilots in every glider, of course, he became a soldier. Now, in point of fact, at Arnhem, D-Day was fine. A lot of them survived. But in Arnhem, there was horrific casualties. There were something like at least 50% of the glider pilot regiment were killed. I don't know how many were wounded. And this is the big problem with the statistics that I've given you. Don't forget, if you have a look at them, don't forget to look at the dispatches. Now, what I must say about this, because you won't know what I'm talking about, a dispatcher, but when we took resupply, now, Arnhem's losses were not in gliding, not in taking the gliders. We got through there and got them down without problems at all to any great extent, except to do the odd one. As I say, they didn't get there. All the trouble came when the Germans, who we discovered afterward, of course, knew all about it, because the head of the Dutch underground was a German spy. So they knew we were there, so they were on the way down. We knew all this in the briefing and everything else, because our own CO was against the whole operation, Hollingford, Air Vice Marshal Hollingford. I mean, another time I'll tell you about some of the things that are crazy and mad about what happens in war, particularly an airborne operation like this. When you've got to resupply, you're very vulnerable, because you have to come down to a maximum. Normally we try and drop them around about 800 feet. The parachutes open, and they don't disperse your load of food, ammunition, whatever it might be. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have put food in there, because food was carried within the aircraft in 4 great big baskets, and you had 2 dispatchers from the army who flew with you for those operations, and they did in every case. They did it even with the glider towing, and they would throw the baskets out. They had a parachute on them, and they were attached to the normal strip. Out they'd go down through the bottom of the aircraft, in our case, and those poor guys, the number of them, I think, just a minute, I'll give you what I've got here from my logbook. Oh, 17th September, glider. Generally okay, no real fact or worries. 19th September, resupply, ground forces, hit by flak. Dispatcher was slightly wounded. 20th, resupply, ground forces, heavily hit by flak. Lost 2 engines, the starboard inner and the port outer. 2 dispatchers wounded, 1 slightly, the other seriously. 21st, well, that's when the AVM, the Air Vice Marshal, came down in the evening and stopped me. Now, because I had 2 engines out, and I did get back. I was the 3rd aircraft back out of 24 for my squadron, and only, I think, the 8th aircraft back for the 2 squadrons. That day, it was a shocker. Of course, I had no aircraft to operate then for the next day. So I was spent the next day accepting new aircraft. Then it says 23rd, resupply, hit by flak. Focke-Wulf 150s hit us. Dispatcher, wounded, slightly wounded. Now, that's 8 times I had 8 dispatchers. You just take the number of times they're wounded. But this, in the statistics, you'll see there were the 200 odd of the dispatchers killed. You will not find anything about wounded, nor will you find anything about wounded air crew or anything else, or glider pilots. And the glider pilots were quite tragic. They really were. They really got knocked to hell and never recovered. So that was Arnhem, if you like. Greater wingspan than that we did, but they needed it to lift the stuff. But of course their bodies weren't as great and massive as we were. And I have some photographs here of to give you an idea. There is a little photograph here of a horse glider cockpit. If some of you want to see, I'll put it out on the table there for a few minutes before we go. And this is a part of a glider. That's just the entrance. So they're all Australians, even the glider pilots. That's why that's taken, because I was the public relations officer for the station and got them down, and they took photographs just before we took off for Arnhem. Big the Stirling tail plane was. Just seemed to think I did a rather good job last year. They wanted me to go and stay with them personally and privately, which is rather nice. I'm looking forward to it.